And welcome back to Irish American Magazine. My name is Tom Deignan. Today, my guest is Terry Golway, historian, author, professor, scholar, and even sometimes a gentleman. He's added a new line to his resume. He has added novelist to his resume. Terry is here to talk about his new novel, Terror in America, a Sherlock Holmes adventure. And if you're out there asking yourself, what the heck does Sherlock Holmes have to do with the Irish? Well, that's what Terry Golway is here to talk about. Terry, welcome to Irish American Magazine.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Welcome back, that is. I guess we've known each other for a very long time, both for better or worse from Staten Island, Irish Americans from Staten Island. I have not accomplished much in this journalism publishing world, but I would have accomplished a lot less if not for Terry's graciousness and help. So thank you for all the help and networking along the way. You know, there is this whole Irish American world out there that you're very tied into. So thanks for that. Great to have you here. And let's just talk about the book. I mean, first and foremost, why did you settle on Sherlock Holmes? Before we even get into the question of fiction, had you always been a Sherlock Holmes fan?
Yes. And to bring it back to Staten Island, one of the most memorable courses I took in high school at Monsignor Farrell High School on Staten Island was a class called The Fiction of A.C. Doyle. Now, I'll be honest, I had no idea who A.C. Doyle was, Arthur Conan Doyle, who is the author of the Sherlock Holmes canon. All I knew is that I loved the teacher, John Sonic. I remember his name, English teacher. And at Farrell, your senior year, at least back then, you had pretty much done all of the requirements. So it was almost like going to college senior year where you could pick and choose your classes. So, and you're an educator, so you hopefully you know what this is like when you inspire students. This teacher really inspired me with his Shakespeare class. So I thought, I don't know who A.C. Doyle is, but I know who John Sonic is, and I'm going to take this class. So it was a class in Sherlock Holmes. And that's what got me hooked. Ever since then, in 1972, I've probably read the Holmes canon, which consists of with something like 60 short stories and four novels. I've probably read each one at least three times, if not four.
What do you think it was that I'm just fascinated by that, first of all, because sometimes, any writer can stumble along something deep into their career and wow, I'm so turned on by this, I want to pursue it. This has been nestling in your head for decades. What do you think kept you going back to that?
Well, I think that Sherlock just the writing, the stories, and frankly, the creation of not just Sherlock as a character, but Victorian London as a character. The way that A.C. Doyle was able to create a sense of place and turn London into a character intrigued me too. And of course, I'm a proud Irish American. I've written a great deal about Irish American history, but by the same token, I am fascinated by English history, particularly of Victorian period, because at first it has such an impact on Ireland anyway. So I think it was that. And then, of course, watching Sherlock Holmes films, Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce as the bumbling Dr. Watson, which is so untrue to the stories themselves. And then when the Jeremy Brett series came along on BBC in the, I guess it would have been the late 80s, early 90s, I guess. Those were fabulous as well. And that kept the interest in Sherlock alive. And then when I started to do research into John Devoy, the great Fenian, whose biography I wrote 30 years ago, and found out about things like the Dynamite Campaign and everything that was going on in Ireland and in New York in the 1880s, right around the turn of the millennium, around 2000, I got the idea, it's like, wow, wait a minute. So all this is going on in New York, and London. There's a bombing campaign. Where was Sherlock Holmes? Well, we finally have the answer.
And a lot, or to some degree, you generated some answers here, right? You're blending a little bit of, well, it's almost like it's rooted in real history, but it's also a fictional character in real history. And then is it fair to say you're sort of tweaking the biography of a fictional character?
Oh yeah, without question. And I mean, the prime audience is the people listening right now. The prime audience is Irish Americans. It's a very Irish American take on Sherlock. But by the same token, I wanted to be as true as I could be to the Sherlockian canon. So, for
Which
example,
has its intense, passionate
oh
devotees.
my goodness. Yes. Um, and so, for example, I did have a Sherlockian read the novel, and he did make some really good suggestions. But one of the things that bothered him is that in the novel, I have Sherlock pointing out to Watson as he becomes immersed in this world of Irish nationalism and Irish radicalism, he points out that Professor Moriarty and Colonel Moran, who are his, great villains, that, oh, isn't it interesting that they have these conspicuously Irish names? Now, a Sherlockian said to me, "There's no way Sherlock would have said that in 1885. There's just like Moriarty doesn't enter the canon until around 1887." To which I said, "Oh well."
Yeah. I mean, as I read that in your book, and I can't profess to be any kind of sort of expert in this area, so I read it and I said, yes, they are Irish names. Interesting. And it made me want to look into whether or not the story had ever made much of it. You just answered that question. And I think that's what sort of historical fiction is for, right?
Yep.
Um, so the other thing that's worth mentioning, though, about how enduring Sherlock Holmes is just in a time of fascination with I mean, our fascination with crime, true crime, detective stories in general. You have to trace so much of that back to Sherlock Holmes, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Um,
So the big question then is, what the heck do the Irish have to do with someone who maybe the only more British person we think of is Shakespeare and Winston Churchill, maybe? Like, what is the Irish connection to both Holmes and Arthur Conan Doyle? Are they the same? Kind of give us some of the Irish background that you're playing with here.
well, Doyle himself has Irish blood and was Jesuit trained, as a matter of fact.
Did he
Uh,
live as a devout Catholic? This is a technical question to throw at you, but I know his family was Catholic, not Protestant, as far as I know.
That's right. That's right. And I think he did, although later on, he did, after his son died, I think in World War One, he sort of became a mystic, very much into spiritualism. Whether he was a practicing Catholic when he was writing in the late 19th century, I don't know. But I- Doyle's Irishness does come out in a couple of stories, including one of his last, which is called His Last Bow, or His Last Bow. Well, I'm actually not sure which, but in that story, Holmes is disguised as an Irish American who's helping the Germans on the eve of World War One, and in it, the thought was Holmes was already retired, but he comes back to help England, as World War One is starting, but he reunites with Watson in the story, and he tells Watson that he had spent a couple of years, 1912, he says, he had spent in Chicago infiltrating Irish American organizations there, which to me says, oh my goodness, maybe I have a sequel.
You're always thinking the right way, Terry. But I'm trying really hard not to be sarcastic about this. You know the way the world is right now. One of the things your books, but very much this book as well, which by the way, we're talking about Terry's first novel, Terror in America, a Sherlock Holmes adventure. One of the things this book makes very clear is that past immigration, the Irish in particular, or the Irish amongst, however you want to put it, there is this notion out there that immigrants used to be so well behaved and they came to the United States and just became automatic Americans and ignored everything that went on in their homeland. I mean, again, since I can't be sarcastic about this, I'll be blunt. That's a lot of hogwash. I mean, tell us a little bit, sort of give us a little history as well as what's in the book. What is the crime or the disruption that Sherlock and Watson are investigating in your book, Terror from America?
Well, at first, the book opens with Watson and Holmes discussing a failed bombing in London, which is based, in fact, I would say 80% of what's in the book is either actual or dis thinly disguised actual events.
This is an 1880s Fenian bombing campaign
That's
in London.
correct.
Yeah.
Right. So I have this happening in late 1884. There's a failed bombing of London Bridge, which is not Tower Bridge. Most people think that the famous sort of Gothic kind of bridge right by the Tower of London is London Bridge. It's not. London Bridge is actually just a normal bridge. But at around this time, in real life, several Irish Americans tried to bomb London Bridge and kill themselves. They never found the bodies. Well, in my book, that starts with that actual event. It's a little out of place in terms of time, but Watson and Holmes are discussing it, and they're visited by Holmes's smarter brother, Mycroft, who Holmes fans will know sometimes is described as the brain of the British government. And along with him comes a guy named George Jenkins, who's actually based on a real character. And they're basically saying, look, we're tired. The government is fed up with these bombings by Irish Americans, and they propose that Sherlock go to New York to try to break up these what they call murder societies. So at this time in real life, young men were getting on ships from New York, going to London, where they had bomb factories, and they bombed Scotland Yard, the House of Commons, several of the train stations. Casualties actually were kept to a minimum, and I think that was done on purpose. So, in any case, Holmes goes to New York to investigate this, and while he's there, two British diplomats are murdered in Central Park, which is a thinly disguised version of the famous murders of two British officials in Dublin's Phoenix Park in 1882. And the plot is similar to real life. British parliamentarians, the British establishment, were determined to blame most of this on Charles Parnell, the great parliamentarian from Ireland. And eventually, in real life, that leads to lawsuits and things like that. In my telling, right, Holmes is ordered by Randolph Churchill, Winston Churchill's father, to find the evidence that these Fenians in New York are bombing London with the say-so of Charles Parnell. So, I mean, that sort of plot is based entirely on real life.
And just to be clear, yes, the crimes were being committed in London, but it wasn't just two or three or four Irishmen in New York, sort of like, hey, let's just meet here, but really all the actions in London, the fundraising, the planning. This was your research on John Devoy. It's why John Devoy is one of the great, sort of lesser known figures in Irish and Irish American history because he was so disruptive. He had a plan, and it was very much New York based, correct?
Oh,
America, New
yeah,
York
yeah,
based.
yeah. I mean, the great historian Joe Lee has said, without New York, there's no Easter Rising. Well, without New York, also, there's none of these events. So in 1880, again, in real life, but this is the background to the book, in the 1880s, Charles Parnell emerges as this Irish leader unlike any other before. He's an aristocrat, he's a landlord, he's Protestant, he's educated in Cambridge, and yet he's a fierce Irish nationalist. In Irish Republican dogma, you don't work with politicians, right? Politics doesn't work. The only answer is violence. So in my book, and again, this is based on real life, Devoy, who is a Republican, a small r Republican, a Fenian, realizes that Parnell may be useful. And the agitation that he is stirring up in Ireland is actually getting something accomplished. So he's trying to work with the parliamentarian. Meanwhile, his one-time friend, Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa, who is in New York and is a legend in New York, he came to New York in 1871 and immediately ran for office against Boss Tweed, right? So he's very famous. And in my telling, Rossa has a drinking problem. That is absolutely true in real life at this time. And he is openly raising money in his newspaper, saying, please send me your money so I can buy more dynamite so we can blow up more things in London. And this is absolutely happening in the open. The British government is sending telegrams to Washington saying, "What is going on?" And incredibly, Washington's response is, we've got this First Amendment thing. So sorry, Brits. And again, this is historically true. I don't go into it too much in the book. I hint at it. But at the time, the American government was under controlled by Union Civil War veterans who never forgot that the English kind of played footsie with the Confederacy. And
And that the Irish fought for the Union.
and the Irish fought for the Union. So, it was mostly the Republican Party, but some Democrats as well, pretty much were saying, you know what, this isn't our problem. So that allowed Rosser, and to some extent Devoy as well, to operate violently, and to stir up what they hope would be revolution in Ireland by bombing London. I mean, it's when I tell people who don't know a whole lot about Irish history, whether they're Irish or not, when I tell them that yes, in this period in the 1880s, what would be the equivalent of the IRA in today's lingo, supposedly, were open raising,
If we had 4 hours, we could explain all the offshoots and all that other
right,
stuff. But
right.
yeah,
But
but
in
I got
essence, Americans were raising money openly to bomb London.
yeah,
Stop, full stop. I mean, what
yeah,
more do you need to know? Yeah.
yeah. So that in a sense, that's why that's what makes this book kind of a little bit it has a little bit for everyone, so to speak. If you're interested in Irish American history, there's tons of sort of stuff you may not be aware of. It's sort of written in a sort of collage kind of manner. You have, parts of Dr. Watson's manuscript, and you have clippings from newspapers and things like that. I guess the next big question I do want to ask you, though, the most famous character remains Sherlock Holmes. He has to sort of plunge himself into this Irish American underworld. What did you think you wanted to do with Holmes confronting that? And is that what kind of ended up on the page?
I wanted Holmes as my image of Sherlock Holmes is framed not just by Arthur Conan Doyle, but also by some portrayals of him on film. And particularly a film that was called Murder by Decree, where Christopher Plummer plays Sherlock Holmes investigating Jack the Ripper. And in that film, Christopher Plummer's Sherlock Holmes is so appalled by the corruption that he sees in the British government. Because in this telling, the British were covering up the Jack the Ripper crime, that Jack the Ripper was, I forget which one of Victoria's sons, but he basically turns on the establishment. And there's a wonderful scene at the end where he is very accusatory of the British establishment and of Prime Minister Gladstone. So that's the Sherlock I wanted to capture, who was, yes, he was an Englishman and probably certainly an English patriot, but he also was skeptical of the imperial order, I think, skeptical of power, skeptical of the British establishment. So with his objective eyes, he comes to New York. And what I try to do in Sherlock's voice is to open his eyes. Because the question he keeps raising is, why are they doing this? What is leading people, what are leading Irish Americans to get on board ships, going and get dynamite from Liverpool or wherever the factories were, risking their lives to blow up English targets? Like what was the motivation? And he comes to understand and tells Watson, a lot of these people were famine immigrants or had children of famine immigrants. So there's this overarching theme in the movie, maybe it will be a movie,
Yeah.
in the book about revenge for Skibbereen, which is one of the code words that's used. And what I was trying to do is get Holmes to understand why these men were doing what they did. And I think I
Because a
did a good
person
job.
from Holmes' background and that context, I mean, there was, and one could even say somewhat understandably, there was a rabid sort of anti-Irish backlash to this, because, these are dangerous things are happening, and some people around Holmes have very not nice things to say about all of the Irish, not just those participating in this sort of campaign.
Right. Well, one of the villains in the book is Randolph Churchill, who, was a very up and coming conservative, big C conservative, backbencher, or I guess he might have been a shadow minister or whatever, but he was, well, he thought well on his way to becoming prime minister, which he never achieved. Did become Chancellor of the Exchequer. But he is telling Holmes that, and again, I think this is based in fact, not just Churchill, but the whole British establishment felt that if they couldn't control Ireland, how could they control India? Right? I mean, if the Indians or any other parts of the empire were to see the Irish break off, then the empire collapses. And there's some merit. I mean, the end of the British Empire begins with the establishment of the Irish Free State. I mean, that's where it starts. So Randolph Churchill is demanding that Holmes find the evidence because Parnell, in his view, is the link, right? If they can make Parnell into a villain, if they can link Parnell to murder, then the Irish nationalist campaign comes to a crashing halt and the empire is preserved. But yes, in my telling, Randolph Churchill does not have many good things to say about the Irish. And remember, it is around this time that Churchill aligns with the Orange movement in what is today Northern Ireland.
You mentioned you mismentioned movie earlier, but of course Sherlock Holmes is one of these people who's so iconic because it's not just rooted anymore in the books and the short stories. It's movies, it's TV shows, constantly being reinterpreted. Was there any intimidation on your part to say, "Hey, this is, I don't want to catch heat from these devoted fans"? Was there any sort of feeling or worry along those lines, or did you feel like that you were excited to sort of reinterpret this character once
I
again?
was I was not intimidated at all. I was totally excited, mainly because, as I said earlier, I mean, I've been reading this stuff since 1973. And I felt I knew it. I'll be honest, I first got the idea for this book, as I said, around the year 2000. I couldn't have written it back then. I just didn't have the chops, and I probably would have been intimidated. But I'm 70 years old now. You know what? If you don't like it, that's okay. I'm okay with that. But I did feel that I knew Sherlock well enough by this point. And again, you're absolutely right. It's not just the A.C. Doyle. It's also watching Jeremy Brett and watching, Christopher Plummer. Not so much Basil Rathbone, but certainly the Christopher Plummer interpretation really impacted me. I don't think I would have been able to write it quite so confidently if I hadn't seen that movie.
People may not be aware. I know I was pretty surprised. I did something for the magazine about Doyle's Irish background, and there are only four novels. I mean, I know we know Holmes from a lot of short stories, but in the end, there's only four novels. And actually, the fourth one has a pretty intense Irish connection too. Valley of Fear, I believe, is
Mhm.
kind of dabbles in the Molly Maguires, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Um, and again, this is such a great way for people to sort of get a little bit of entertainment, detective story, but also not just Irish American history, but sort of the Irish American history you don't always get. Like you don't get the Molly Maguires, you don't get the Fenian movement because they're complicated.
Yes. Yes. And by the way, A.C. Doyle, at a certain point, killed off Sherlock Holmes, right? He fell down the Reichenbach Falls and he's dead. And that was because Doyle considered himself a historical, he wanted to write historical novels. And Holmes was getting in the way. So he kills him off so he can focus more on historical novels, which, I mean, Valley of Fear is a great example of that. Holmes is probably in Valley of Fear, I don't know, 20% of the story, maybe not even. Most of the story is set in the Schuylkill Valley of Pennsylvania, and it's all about the Molly Maguires. So that's what Doyle imagined himself to be, a novelist writing about history. But he had to bring back Holmes. I mean, eventually, and he did. And I sort of consider this book, although the subtitle is A Sherlock Holmes Adventure, but it's really a historical novel, I think. I hope I'm not being pretentious, but that's really how I imagined it, with numerous points of view. As you said, it's not just told as a Watson story. You get Watson's point of view, you get Holmes's point of view, but you also get John Devoy's point of view. And it was weird writing in John Devoy's voice, considering I had written his biography and now I'm turning him into a fictional character. And also, do have to mention there is a very conspicuous female character, a poet in John Devoy's newspaper, and she goes by the pen name of Maeve of Connacht, which is a character from Irish mythology. And she becomes a really important character. I'm not going to, if I start talking more about her, I give the plot away, but take my word for it. Maeve of Connacht becomes a really important character, and Sherlock is misled in his pursuit, shall we say? And once again, that goes back to the Holmes canon of Holmes being outsmarted by a woman, which happens in Study in Scarlet, which is the first novel, the first story.
As most of the Baker Street irregulars would probably know.
Right.
Another great connection to sort of Irish American history I liked. Again, I don't know how. I mean, I'm actually taking your word for this that this is true, but you linked the Tammany boss, Murphy, right? Who
Yes.
was his were his roots in Skibbereen?
No, but what I tried to do with Murphy is first of all, I love the character of Charles Francis Murphy. You know, when people tell this will again, if we have 5 hours, I would go on and on. But Charles Francis Murphy was the boss of Tammany Hall from 1902 to 1924. He is the one who brought Al Smith to the New York public. He's the one who brought Robert Wagner. If that's all he did in his life is give New York Al Smith and Robert Wagner, that's a pretty good life. But you know, he was the son of a famine immigrant, and I always felt that that might explain why he got behind social welfare reforms as he did in the early 20th century. But in the book, Holmes comes across Charlie Murphy hanging out by his saloon, which he did every night as a young Tammany ward healer, listening to constituents. And he at the time was the docks commissioner. So he ran the docks on the west side. So there's an element of mystery there. Like, okay, what's going on? How did these people escape? I can't tell you who they are. You have to read the book. But there's this insinuation that Charlie Murphy might be working with the Fenians. Now, I don't think he was back then, but again, to bring it back to real life, during the debates over the treaty, the Anglo-Irish Treaty in late 1921 and 1922, Harry Boland said at one point that he would never criticize Tammany Hall because Tammany Hall had given more money to the Republican cause, small r, of course, than anybody else. And, you know, that was Charlie Murphy's Tammany Hall. So that also opened all sorts, as a historian, I'm thinking, whoa, wait a minute, was Tammany raising money for the IRA during the War of Independence? That's interesting. Harry Boland seemed to say that that was true. So that led me to say, well, what if Charlie Murphy was sort of part of the movement, in the 1880s?
And again, though, the tying it back to the famine experience, I mean, all
Right.
these things, the broader thing that you're making me think about here is again, this is not like wow, things got a little crazy for 6 months. You mentioned earlier that the Sherlock Holmes book about collaborating with the Germans, and that would have been around the World War I time, right? And
Yep.
this is not something that stopped in 1882. There was an ongoing thing, and we can say it's right and we can say it's wrong. But it's a complicated part of history that we should know more about.
Yes, yes. And what better way to tell it, frankly, than through a novel, through Sherlock Holmes, through some of these characters that a lot of Irish Americans, I think, might have heard of O'Donovan Rossa. Unfortunately, not Devoy, although if you buy my book, you will.
Well,
Uh,
I mean, I was gonna. We're talking to Terry Golway. We're talking about his Terror from America, a Sherlock Holmes adventure. I have two more questions for you, Terry. But before I get to them, people should absolutely. Terry's written something like 12 or so books. We last spoke about your Fiorella LaGuardia book, but the Devoy book and the Tammany Hall book. I mean. Again and again, I return to them for my own, just to get facts and figures. I just reviewed a book for Commonweal magazine. It'll be coming out in a few weeks. And this book, without calling out the author or the topic or anything, it does talk a lot about Irish immigration. It does not have much to say about Tammany Hall or political machines in general. And that's your book really fills in that gap. So, because I don't think you can understand the Irish in America without Devoy and Tammany Hall at the very least. And
I
and,
agree.
and that'll give me great background reading for the Sherlock Holmes book here. Uh, One final question I did want to ask you, just strictly in terms of writing. You mentioned the interesting thing about writing about Devoy as a biographer and then inhabiting his voice. What was the process of writing fiction in general like for you?
Great.
Yeah, tell me more. What,
I
like, what a
loved it.
lot you've heard those pretentious artists say how what a struggle it is.
I wasn't a struggle.
Why are they
No.
wrong? Why are they wrong, Terry? Give them a lesson, Terry. What did you like about it?
Well, I like writing, and the idea of creating something out of whole cloth, which, people like Peter Quinn would accuse me of doing that in my journalism. Okay, that's an
And
inside joke, folks. Sorry.
he wouldn't be the only one.
But more than any other book I've written, this really was mine. I made up a character out of whole cloth called Maeve of Connacht. She is actually, other than Watson and Holmes, who clearly never lived, Maeve of Connacht was my baby. I created her. Everybody else is sort of based on real historical figures, but I was able to, by telling the story through multiple points of view, I was able to almost do method acting as a writer. And I got to tell you, I mean, I don't know how much more of this I am going to do, but if I have another book in me, you can be sure it's going to be fiction. Because let me tell you something, whatever other writers might say, writing fiction, in my view, is for me was a lot easier than slogging through, years of research to write a Tammany Hall book, for example.
Yeah, you're not constrained by facts. Although these days, not too many people are constrained by facts. Did you kind of answered this question earlier by saying you've been sort of reading Sherlock Holmes for decades? Did you have to do much in the way of new research, or was this all sort of swimming around in the cranium?
A little of both. The summer before I started writing, I don't remember the exact scenario, but the only thing I read for about 5 months was Sherlock Holmes. I just kept rereading all the stories. I watched the Jeremy Brett stuff that from the 1980s, and because I just wanted to get into Sherlock mode. And then I read The Tenets of Time. I read the trilogy by Thomas Flanagan, and I read Peter Quinn's fantastic Banished Children of Eve. So that's all I read for a year. Sherlock Holmes, Thomas Flanagan, Peter Quinn. And I said,
Final, but
yeah.
why did you feel the need to read ten? Why those? But you could have read many historical novels. Why did you pick those?
Well, particularly Tenets of Time, which was the middle book of Flanagan's trilogy, deals with the same time period. Parnell, Devoy, the Land War, the Dynamite Campaign. So that was timely. And frankly, I so admire Peter Quinn and I admire Flanagan. I wanted to see how it's done, and I
Yeah.
thought that was pretty good, a pretty good way to learn.
Even rereading the Holmes, I know I do this all the time. You kind of think you know something, you think you're familiar with something, but the rereading or even rewatching a movie, there's many things you think you know, but you've forgotten. And there are a lot of benefits to sort of making sure. Maybe that's just the historian in me, but if you're ever in doubt about, should I go back and double check that? Go back and double check
Go
that.
back and double check. Yep.
Absolutely. All right. We have been talking to Terry Golway. Terror from America, a Sherlock Holmes adventure is his latest book, a first novel. And Terry, final question, quick one. Are you here saying right here, right now, that there may be a sequel?
There may be a sequel.
There may be a sequel. Hopefully, we'll have better timing. We are conducting this interview on the day after International Sherlock Holmes Day. Wonderful Irish timing there. Uh, Terry Galway, thank you so much for joining us here on Irish America Magazine.
Go Margaret.